session called Making Peace After War. Matthias Tarnopolsky has thanked a lot of people during the course of the last few days, and I think no one has really thanked him. And we're blessed to have him as the director of Cal Performances, and he and his staff have put on a remarkable program in the last few days and in seasons past and in seasons to come. So I think we should thank him. In a way, our session today on making peace after war is really more or less continuous, I think, intellectually and emotionally, with the one tomorrow on mastering the past. That is, and the reason for that is, I think, is that tomorrow, as the day, is about what happens when the killing ends. That is to say, how do the living remake their worlds? How do they remake their worlds politically, economically, culturally, and emotionally? In some sense, the last talk was really about many of those topics. We know a lot about how wars begin. We know a great deal from military historians and others how wars proceed. We usually know about how the war ends in a kind of final treaty or final battle. But after that, we know relatively little. The history of the political issues of war, of revanchism, of how France after the Franco-Prussian War, Germany after the First World War, America after the South after the Civil War, and other countries sort of tried to recoup losses, is something that's relatively understudied. We know relatively little about political rebuilding. There's a whole history of the cleanup. The pictures we saw this morning of all these bodies on the landscape, millions of bodies, 10 million bodies, had to be cleaned up by someone. Tens of thousands of people died in the cholera epidemic after the war, just cleaning up the mess in a concrete sense. Then there's remembering of sorts, of different sorts. There's poetry, there's music we heard about. There the great battlefields, and here I think World War I is a memory. There's integrating the war into the present and making a usable past. There's remembering those, as Adam has written about so brilliantly, remembering those who rejected the war, who refused to go to war, remembering the dead who didn't die for what was taken to be the heroic cause, those who were executed. We saw this in those horrific pictures this morning of people hanged. And actually the British Army hanged more per capita even than the Austrian Army for desertion during the war. Then there's specific issues that I think we're able to address, of how a particular cultural institution like the Vienna Philharmonic, in some sense, makes peace with its different pasts. There's how a particular piece of music, I think Michael will speak about that, is different after each of the great wars and becomes part of the remaking of the social order. So today, and I think tomorrow at 11 o'clock, we will be dealing with these broad issues of making peace after war, or mastering a past. So we have three speakers, and I won't introduce them at length because, again, it's in your program, but the first speaker is Adam Hochschild, who teaches at the Graduate School of Journalism and is a well-known writer. One of his books actually has, I think, done something very rare. He actually has changed how a country sees its past and understands its past. I think King Leopold's Ghost, his fabulous book on the Congo, is probably the single biggest influence on Belgium reconsidering its history. But today he's going to speak out of his more recent book, which is To End All Wars, A Story of Loyalty and Rebellion, 1914 to 1918. Adam.
Thank you, Tom. Here's the point that I want to begin with in this question of how we remember wars. It seems to me that here we are on the centenary of the beginning of World War I, and we're in a great paradox, which is this. I think most people in most of the countries that participated in that war would agree today that it was senseless folly. But when we look at the institutionalized ways in which this war gets remembered, almost all of them honor it as something almost sacred. Let me elaborate on what I mean. First, on the first part of it about the folly. I think, as I say, most people in most of the participating countries today would feel that this war was not fought for any great cause or any matter of principle, that the claims made at the time were close to being complete nonsense. The Allies claimed to be fighting for democracy, but this was a pretty hard thing to say when one of the principal allies was Imperial Russia, the last surviving absolute monarchy in Europe. And of course, democracy didn't apply to the colonies of any of the participating countries, and one of the aims for which the war was fought ultimately was trying to get hold of the colonies of the other side. And life there remained as undemocratic after the war as it had been beforehand. Germany claimed that it was fighting, to quote Kaiser Wilhelm II, for right, freedom, honor, and morality. Well, tell that to anybody whose country was occupied by German soldiers between 1914 and 1918. Now, there may be some exceptions in some places to people who felt there was a good reason to fight this war. I can certainly understand how people in France and Belgium, for example, felt that they had a right to resist the attempt to conquer their country. But I still think that today, almost everybody would agree that the war was not worth it, that it remade the world for the worse in every conceivable way. It left some 9 million soldiers dead, another 21 million wounded, some of them horribly so. It left many more millions of civilians dead. We'll never know the exact death toll there. And of course, it left behind it a widespread bitterness and resentment that led to an even more destructive war some 20 years later. Moreover, I think when we look back on this war, most people today would agree that, especially during the first few years of fighting, it was fought in a particularly stupid way. Both sides, in the Western Front, Britain, France, Germany, repeatedly sent wave after wave of these poor young soldiers ordered out of their trenches to walk forward into machine gun fire, direct machine gun fire, and barbed wire. And they fell by the millions. It was fought stupidly in other ways. There was no sense of camouflage or protection. Millions of French infantrymen went to war in 1914 wearing a uniform that consisted of bright red pantaloons, bright blue jackets, and bright red caps. The Austro-Hungarian cavalry also was quite fond of bright red and blue and wore those colors until 1916. The German soldiers had those funny little spikes on their helmets, but the helmets in the early months of the war were not even made out of metal. They were made out of leather. So there were many things about this war that were, I come back to the word stupid, inept in how it was fought. Moreover, it was a war that didn't have to happen. 6 weeks before it began, Europe was at peace. No country openly claimed a piece of another country's territory. Germany was Britain's largest trading partner. Some 5 weeks before the war began, a large part of the British fleet was in Germany for the annual Elbe Regatta, and when these battleships turned around and weighed anchor and sailed for home, the British commander signaled to his German counterpart, "Friends now and friends forever." Nobody expected the senseless chain of events, missteps by politicians on both sides that began with the assassination at Sarajevo and led to the war. And I think the sense that this was a senseless war that was stupidly fought pervades European and American culture today. It's reflected in, for example, in a lot of the recent fiction, very fine fiction written about this war. The wonderful trilogy of novels, for example, by the British novelist Pat Barker. Very fine book by the French novelist Sébastien Jacques Bizot. And it's the way most historians write about the history of the war. But here's the paradox. Look at the institutions that we have for remembering this war, or for that matter, almost any war, and by their very nature, they are all designed to celebrate heroism, sacrifice, the marvels of military technology, and war as a sacred cause. Museums, for example, and I'm sure many of you have visited First World War museums, like the Imperial War Museum in London, our own Museum of the First World War in Kansas City, the Historial de la Grande Guerre in Péronne, France, the reconstructed tunnels and trenches that you can find on the old Western Front in France and Belgium, and many other such institutions. All of them are, exhibit the military technology of the time, the machine guns, the tanks, the rifles, uniforms of all sorts. Most of these museums show you documentary film footage of the war. They show objects that the soldiers survived from the soldiers' lives, their letters, their postcards, the kind of canned food they ate, the shovels, the tools that they used. In Ypres, Belgium, the scene of terrible fighting during the war, Ypres today calls itself a city of peace. It's a sister city of Hiroshima. But when I looked online the other day at what are the featured exhibits in the First World War Museum there were 3 of them. War and trauma, medical care in World War I, conflict landscapes, a bird's eye view, and headdress and helmets in the Belgian army. These are not things that reflect the view that our culture takes of this war. Monuments, Europe is strewn with monuments, but they are almost always to the fallen soldiers or to the generals who led them. Field Marshal Haig, the commander-in-chief of the British Army on the Western Front, there are monuments to him in London, in France, in Scotland. There are statues of other generals everywhere. And of course, almost anywhere you go, throughout England, France, Germany, Canada, many other countries, you will find in a central town square a monument listing the names of all the young men who died in that war. Now, a statue or a monument has some power because it's something permanent or semi-permanent, stone, designed to celebrate something very impermanent, a human life or a list of human lives. But it's not something designed to remind us, as I wish it would, of the futility of this war and indeed of most wars. Another institution for remembering war is military graveyards, and perhaps some of you have seen those too. There are hundreds of these scattered throughout the old area of the Western Front in northern France and Belgium. I'm sure it's the most dense concentration of young men's graves anywhere in the world. Graveyards are by their very nature sacred spaces. It's the very last place where you would want to suggest that the people in them may have died in vain or for a lie, because families are always terribly eager to believe that a son, a father, a husband, a brother died for some great cause. I remember a few years ago, I visited a number of these graveyards in France, and I remember one in particular, outside the city of Albert. It was a small graveyard, 163 British soldiers buried there, almost all of them from Britain's Devonshire Regiment. Victims of a particularly senseless slaughter in a particularly senseless war. These were men who were killed on the terrible first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916. Their company commander, who was also killed that day and is in this graveyard, had predicted beforehand that they would be killed because their frontline trench, and the graveyard is on that site, was within range of a German machine gun post whose location you can see from that graveyard today. He predicted that fire from that machine gun would kill his men as they climbed out of their trench, and indeed it did. But there's no suggestion of the futility of all this at the graveyard itself. It's a beautiful spot. These British and Commonwealth graveyards are cared for immaculately by a huge squad of gardeners. I looked at the comments in the visitor's book, because they have one of these at every one of these cemeteries. You can write down what you want. Here are some of the things that people wrote. Sleep well, God bless, sleep on, boys, thanks, lad, great uncle thanks, rest in peace, not forgotten, lest we forget. But of course the question is, forget what? There was only one comment that made any sense to me. Someone wrote, never again. I want to end by asking the question, looking back on the First World War, instead of remembering it in those ways I've just enumerated, what are the things that we might want to remember instead? Who are some of the people? Now, some of the people I would love to celebrate on this centenary are the people in almost all of the participating countries who denounced this madness when it was happening and who suffered because of that. In Germany, radicals like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were sent to jail. In the United States, Eugene V. Debs, great labor leader, spoke out very strongly against the war. Repeatedly, after the United States entered it, for this he was sent to prison in 1918. He was still in prison in 1920 when he received nearly 1 million votes for president on the socialist ticket. In Britain, the country's greatest investigative journalist, E.D. Morel, if any of you have read my book, King Leopold's Ghost, that Tom referred to, he was sort of the central hero in that book, was sent to prison for 6 months at hard labor for his opposition to the war. Prison broke his health. He died 6 years later at the age of 51. Bertrand Russell, Britain's greatest philosopher, also 6 months in prison. Russell was an extraordinary man. I came to admire him very much reading about his experiences in that time. And I think part of his greatness lay in the fact that he recognized how hard it was to go against the tremendous upsurge of patriotism that he saw all around him. Let me just read you something about what he wrote describing himself during the period of the First World War. He wrote that he felt tortured by patriotism, for I desired the defeat of Germany as ardently as any retired colonel. Love of England is very nearly the strongest emotion I possess, and in appearing to set it aside at such a moment, I was making a very difficult renunciation. But as a lover of truth, the national propaganda of all the belligerent nations sickened me. As a lover of civilization, the return to barbarism appalled me. As a man of thwarted parental feeling, the massacre of the young wrung my heart. How about a monument to him with that inscription on it? Another person I'd love to see a monument to in Britain is a woman named Emily Hobhouse, who's probably best known as the humanitarian campaigner who exposed the British use of concentration camps in the Boer War, some 15 years before this war began. But she did something remarkable in the First World War that very few people know about. She traveled from England to France, went from France into Switzerland, which was neutral, went from Switzerland to Germany, went to Berlin, and went to, this was in 1916, went to call on the German foreign minister, whom she'd actually known before the war. And she talked about possible peace terms with him. You know, if you did this, if we did this, might you do that? What would be a possible basis for an agreement to end this terrible war? Came back with some ideas, went back to Switzerland, to France, to England, tried and failed to see high-ranking people in the British government who wrote her off as a complete crackpot and quickly rushed a law through Parliament, making it illegal to travel onto the enemy's territory, which, oddly enough, there had not been a law forbidding beforehand, and nothing came of her mission. But in this war that killed so many millions of people, she was the only human being who traveled from one side to the other and back again in search of peace. I'd love to see a monument to her. Some other people I'd like to see remembered are the war resistors, the people who refused to fight. In the United States, there were more than 500 conscientious objectors who were imprisoned. In Britain, more than 20,000 young men of military age refused the draft, and many of them, as a matter of principle, refused the alternative service that was offered for conscientious objectors as well, which could mean driving an ambulance at the front or working in a war industry. More than 6,000 of them went to jail under very harsh conditions. Up to that point, the largest number of people ever imprisoned for political reasons in a Western democracy. In Russia, there were some 800 religious pacifists who were jailed. And of course, as the Russian army collapsed in 1917, more than 1 million Russian soldiers simply deserted their positions and walked home. In France, there were soldiers who mutinied and refused to fight on. In Germany, towards the end of the war, there were tens of thousands of deserters. There are very, very few memorials to such people that I know of. There's a memorial stone to the British war resistors in Tavistock Square, London, put up some 80 years after the war. There are several monuments in Germany to deserters from World War II, where it was regarded as an anti-Nazi act, but none to deserters from the First World War. Final anecdote. A few years ago, when I was writing a book about some of these things, I spent a week traveling along the old Western Front in France and Belgium. And in that entire week, I saw only one monument of any kind celebrating anybody for doing something other than fighting or dying. It was homemade. It was not officially dedicated by the government of one country for another. It was on the outskirts of Ypres. It was a chest-high wooden cross of sturdy wooden beams, and next to it was a small fir tree which had some Christmas ornaments on it. It was a monument to the Christmas truce of 1914, that wonderful spontaneous event where, without the knowledge of the top commanders on either side, thousands of soldiers came out of their trenches, stopped fighting on Christmas Day, and traded gifts, traded food, played soccer in no man's land, and this particular monument was on the spot where one of the soccer games is said to have taken place. And here at last, I felt, was somebody remembering something that we ought to remember from this war, and I'd like to see a lot more of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You can't see the little label on William McElheney's jacket, but it says retired member of the Vienna Philharmonic. But there's a backstory to that. He's a local boy made good. He went to Berkeley High, played trombone in various Berkeley High ensembles, and then made his way east to Indiana, and then Bavaria, yes, and then south, a little further east to Vienna, where in 1984 he became a trombonist with the Vienna Philharmonic. And he retired from that job in 2005 and began the work in administration with the Philharmonic, in media and communications, and history. And he still coaches trombone, so he hasn't given it up completely, but we now welcome him sort of into our fold. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Well, despite my accent, I'm very pleased to be the only Viennese on this afternoon's panel. Thanks very much. Our ongoing fascination with Vienna as a unique center of culture also justifies our taking a closer look at the history of the city's most prominent musical ensemble, the Vienna Philharmonic. To get a sense of how the orchestra's musical reputation developed and how this in turn has at times pulled it into the political arena, it's beneficial to have a look at the circumstances surrounding the orchestra's foundation. A surprising observation about Vienna in 1840 is that the city of Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven had no orchestra dedicated to the performance of the symphonic compositions of these masters. A professional musician at that time played in one of the opera houses or theaters, but symphonic repertoire was relegated to rare and under-rehearsed performances by orchestras thrown together from a mix of professional and amateur musicians. The best-known example of this was the premiere of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in 1824. The musicians were from the opera orchestra, who later formed the Vienna Philharmonic, and they were supplemented by other amateur instrumentalists. Although generating great public interest, there were only 2 rehearsals for this brand new and very difficult work. So in view of the improvised nature of such endeavors, the desire among the musically literate in Vienna for high-quality performances of this important body of repertoire remained acute. In 1841, a young and charismatic conductor named Otto Nicolai came to Vienna, to the Vienna Opera, and soothed wowed audiences with stunning performances of Beethoven's Third Leonore Overture, a piece hitherto considered unplayable, which he inserted between the 2 acts of the opera Fidelio. The idea was thus born that the court opera orchestra with Nicolai at the helm would be the ensemble capable of doing justice to the Viennese symphonic repertoire. Even more notable than the stated goal of performing the best repertoire with the best personnel at the highest level were the methods chosen to achieve it. The opera orchestra was composed of 2 distinct groups. The elites were the prestigious members of the Hofmusikkapelle, the emperor's personal musicians, who performed chamber music in the salons of the nobility, were paid high salaries, and enjoyed numerous benefits. In contrast, the rest of the musicians labored in relative obscurity with little pay and had to beg for a pension when they got too old to play well anymore. So, if this noble goal of presenting the greatest repertoire at the highest level was going to be realized, the 2-class system within the orchestra had to be addressed, and the 2 groups would have to come together in pursuit of this common purpose. The structure developed for the Philharmonic Orchestra was based on equal rights, equal responsibilities, and equal pay for all members, with the musicians themselves being solely responsible for the artistic quality and the economic viability of the undertaking. Decision-making was done on a democratic basis, with each member having 1 equal vote, whether concertmaster or trombone player. Here we see a break with the status quo on 2 levels. The emphasis on the repertoire of a German national character was a turning away from the Italian musical style preferred by the unpopular monarchy, while the implementation of autonomous and democratic structures were in accord with the burgeoning aspirations of an educated and ascendant middle class, of which writers and musicians were visionaries. Dissatisfaction with the political system and a yearning for increased personal liberties were catalysts of the revolution which swept Vienna and other European cities only 6 years later, in 1848. With its commitment to excellence in performance, the Philharmonic developed throughout the second half of the 19th century, working with the finest composers such as Verdi, Wagner, Brahms, and Bruckner, and being shaped by 3 long-term conductors in particular, Otto Nicolai, Otto Dessau, and Hans Richter. By the time the era of Gustav Mahler dawned, the orchestra was generally viewed as the finest in Europe. From 1842 until today, the orchestra has carried out the double function of playing as employees of the Vienna Opera and in concert as the independent Vienna Philharmonic. This is not merely a matter of logistics, however. This unique musical symbiosis between opera house and concert stage forms an essential component of the orchestra's musical identity. In the years before World War I, the orchestra's season consisted of a small number of select concerts in Vienna, and it hardly ever appeared outside of Austria. The war, however, led directly to a strong upswing in the amount of concert activity. It was at this time that the era of the Vienna Philharmonic as a national symbol of Austria began. The first noticeable increase in Philharmonic activity during the Great War was attributable to the numerous benefit concerts performed for various charitable organizations supporting members of the military, the widows, the orphans, the wounded, and the refugees, of whom we saw so many pictures this morning. These concerts not only raised money for those in need, but were intended to boost the morale of the populace and can be seen as conscious efforts to undergird the war effort. Another interesting development is the fact that during the war, audience interest in Philharmonic concerts surged strongly. The orchestra had to double the number of subscription concerts in 1917 in order to meet increased demand. Here we have evidence that the darkness of the times drove large numbers of people to look for diversion and solace through music. Moreover, also in 1917, the Austrian Emperor Charles was exploring the possibility of a separate peace agreement with the Allies. Austria's cultural significance played a role in this diplomatic offensive, and the Philharmonic was pressed into service by the Foreign Ministry as a special ambassador, presenting concerts in 8 different cities in neutral Switzerland. For the first time, this artistic institution performed a political role on the international stage as a cultural representative of its people. This trend continued even after World War I. The orchestra's chairman of the 1930s had close ties to the government of the Ständestaat. The Philharmonic performed in Italy at a time when ties with that country were considered strategically important. And several members of the orchestra regularly played private chamber music evenings with members of the government in attendance. Thus, by the time Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany in 1938, the orchestra had grown accustomed to a certain proximity to the national government. Right after the Anschluss, the administration of the Vienna State Opera fired the Jewish members of the orchestra, which had the effect of removing them from the Philharmonic as well, because by statute, in order to maintain the highest musical standards, only members of the opera orchestra are eligible for membership in the Philharmonic. The administrative committee of the Philharmonic was turned over to musicians within the orchestra who had been illegal members of the NSDAP before 1938. This time around, the orchestra's political instrumentalization was more ominous, including a performance at the Nazi Party conference in Nuremberg, concerts at factories involved in the war effort, propaganda films, and so on. Worse was the fact that NSDAP membership within the orchestra climbed to close to half by 1945. We can't fully explain the motivations of those who chose to join a party which stood in direct opposition to the orchestra's founding principles and compromised its artistic autonomy. Perhaps the artistic nationalism from the time of the orchestra's founding degenerated into a political nationalism a century later. The orchestra survived the war intact, but paid a heavy price. 7 Jewish members died at the hands of the Nazi regime, and 9 more were forced into an exile from which most of them never returned. And the knowledge of high party membership and complicity with Nazi cultural aims has caused the orchestra grief right up until today. The conductor with whom the orchestra was most closely identified during this period was Wilhelm Furtwängler. Among musicians and audiences alike, Furtwängler's reputation was unrivaled. He was an artistic institution in his own right, and if the Nazis were going to try to position themselves as the legitimate heirs of Germany's musical legacy, they needed Furtwängler on their side. The record of the conductor's dealings with the officials of the Third Reich is a complicated mix of disputes, threats, and compromises. His presence in Germany lent the regime a certain legitimacy, yet he also intervened to protect many Jewish musicians. He secured permission for a large contingent of so-called half-Jewish members to remain in the Vienna Philharmonic for the duration of the war unmolested. However undisputed Furtwängler's reputation was as a conductor, his decision to remain in Germany for the duration of the Third Reich has proved controversial to this day. While he saw himself as a symbol of the cultured and civilized Germany, many felt that he let himself be used as a tool of the Nazi propaganda machine. His case remains an extreme example of how an artist can become hopelessly entangled in the politics of his day. After the war, it was the conductor Bruno Walter who set the tone for the future ambassadorial role of the Philharmonic. Walter's history with the Philharmonic went back to 1901, when he came to the Vienna Opera as a protege of Gustav Mahler. And Walter had conducted the last Philharmonic concerts before the Anschluss in 1938. His return to the helm of the Philharmonic for concerts in Edinburgh in 1947 was a deeply significant statement of his willingness to overcome the past. And in his introductory remarks to the orchestra at that time, he exhorted the musicians also to be role models in this spirit. The concerts were an artistic success and are considered to have improved Austria's reputation abroad. The audiences saw the orchestra's performances as having captured the essence of Vienna as the city of music, even at a time when life in that city was characterized by extreme hardship. Understanding was established between two peoples who only a short time earlier had been at war with one another. Since the 1950s, the Philharmonic has enjoyed a special relationship with the people of Japan, and beginning in 1993, has even made an annual extended tour to that country. The year 2011 provided an unusual perspective on the nature of this special relationship. In the aftermath of the nuclear catastrophe in Fukushima, many members of the orchestra were concerned about possible health risks involved with the upcoming tour. With this tragedy having induced something of a national trauma, to have prominent foreign institutions such as ours canceling visits to the country would have felt to the Japanese like being kicked when they were down. And many of the orchestra's Japanese friends and associates implored the orchestra not to cancel. The tour went ahead as planned and was greeted as a sign of sympathy and solidarity with the Japanese public. Another event which comes to mind in this context was the Philharmonic's first tour to Israel in 1988, with concerts in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem under Leonard Bernstein. Bernstein had first conducted the Philharmonic in 1966, and by the time I joined the orchestra in 1981, he had become one of its most beloved conductors. The tour to Israel was ostensibly on the occasion of Bernstein's 70th birthday, but obviously there were political overtones as well. Austria had just been through the Waldheim affair, which had brought discussion of the country's wartime past back into the international spotlight. In the aftermath of this affair, the Austrian chancellor declared that it was time for the country to face up to the fact that Austria had not only been the first victim of Nazi aggression, which had been a foundational component of Austria's national story since 1945, but that many Austrians had also been willing participants in carrying out the policies of National Socialism. The Philharmonic tour to Israel represented an important step at a significant moment in the process of normalization of the relationship between these two countries. So the discussion of the Israel tour puts us right into a discussion of confronting the past. This could appear to be a subject which might have cooled some over the years, but in Austria, the aforementioned victim theory contributed to a delay in the country's facing up fully to many uncomfortable facts about its past. Thus, when recounting Philharmonic efforts in this area, we find ourselves discussing events of more recent decades. In 1988, the same year as the Israel tour, the orchestra published a tribute to the memories of those members who were persecuted at the hands of the Nazis. In anticipation of the 150th anniversary of the orchestra's founding in 1992, the Philharmonic commissioned its director of the Historical Archives, violinist Clemens Helsberg, to write a comprehensive history of the orchestra. This book addressed in much greater detail than ever before the orchestra's dealings with the National Socialists between 1938 and 1945. In the year 2000, on the 55th anniversary of the liberation of the concentration camp at Mauthausen, the orchestra performed Beethoven's Ninth Symphony as a memorial in the rock quarry where so many had suffered and died so horrendously. Even though the idea originated with the Jewish welcome service, the concert was not uncontroversial, with some survivors feeling that the somber setting would be violated by such a spectacle. The atmosphere at this memorial, however, was solemn and reverent, and the event fueled much-needed discussion about Austria's past. Today, Austria and the Philharmonic still find themselves in the era of confronting the past. In 2012, an Austrian parliamentarian accused the orchestra of continuing to hide details of its activities in the NS era. In response to these allegations, 3 independent historians were invited to augment their previous research in this area with new archive material and to publish their findings on the Philharmonic website without the texts having been previously reviewed by the orchestra. One notable result of this project was gaining more detailed information about the experiences of our persecuted colleagues. This also led to an invitation to all known descendants of these colleagues to come back to Vienna and make the acquaintance of the modern-day Philharmonic. This week-long visit took place in October 2013, and I believe that, although long overdue, it communicated the message that our persecuted colleagues will always occupy an honored place in Philharmonic memory. Interestingly enough, a discussion on confronting the past leads us even to the New Year's concert. It was the conductor Clemens Krauss who in 1929 introduced the practice of performing annual concerts dedicated entirely to the music of the Johann Strauss dynasty. During World War II, such concerts were performed at the New Year and were broadcast on radio. With the introduction of the television broadcasts in 1959, the international popularity of this concert began to surge, and today it is billed as the largest single classical music event in the world. Now, Philharmonic lore has always maintained, based on eyewitness recollections, that these concerts, performed in the war years, represented a subtle assertion of an independent Austrian cultural identity at a time when Austria had been wiped off the map. It is undoubtedly true that many listeners viewed the concerts in this light, but it is also a fact that such concerts fit well into the NS policy of propaganda through entertainment. Thus, the aforementioned romanticized Philharmonic version might not represent the entire story of the development of this popular event. Even though the controversy might seem to be a little more than a storm in a teacup, it demonstrates the need for careful analysis of all aspects of this difficult past. And it illustrates how the same people, the same music, can be perceived in different ways by different groups. The same programs, which were once broadcast as Nazi propaganda, are today enjoyed by millions of peace-loving individuals around the world. Today, the Vienna Philharmonic is committed not only to an ongoing critical evaluation of the past, but it sees its role clearly as a cultural ambassador of humanitarianism, a fact attested to not only by its continued dedication to the performance of the Viennese masters, but also through its numerous charitable activities, educational projects, and developmental initiatives. Still, the orchestra remains foremost a musical association. Its primary focus needs to continue to be the upholding of its musical traditions and the attention to its core repertoire. Its continuing excellence will ensure its ongoing role as an esteemed symbol of Austria and its capital city, which in recent decades has become much more international and cosmopolitan. It is an orchestra proud of its musical heritage and its artistic autonomy. Assuming it has learned the moral lessons from the past, and I believe it has, it will play a positive role in maintaining culture and civilization well into the future. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Michael Steinberg, who flew all the way across the country to be here with us. He's the director of the Humanities Center at Brown University and also professor of history and of music. He's probably, he's one of the world's leading expert really on the cultural history of music in the 19th and 20th century. In the Austrian context, he's best known for a book on the Salzburg Festival, which was hugely controversial when it came out in Austria in 2001, but despite that won the Victor Adler Staatspreis of that year. And he subsequently wrote a book on Judaism, musical and unmusical. He's written on culture and subjectivity in 19th century music. And we look forward to his view on, I think, is it Rigoletto in these two countries?
Falstaff.
Falstaff, well.
I'm going to speak from here largely for chiropractic reasons, since my angle there would have either contorted me or contorted you. I'm aware that I'm speaking at the end of a very long and really magnificent day, and also between two extraordinary concerts, so I would like to be brief, and I would like to try to synthesize a couple of elements that have come up today, especially in the two marvelous talks just now, between what I would call the macrocosm and the microcosm that we're dealing with today. The macrocosm being the extraordinary history, violent history of the 20th century, and the microcosm being the role of music, and specifically the Vienna Philharmonic and Vienna State Opera, located in the middle of Central Europe, in the middle of the war theater and a subsequent Cold War of the 20th century. If we think of the microcosm of culture in Vienna from the celebrated fin du siècle through the middle of the 20th century, even from earlier than the fin du siècle, and put the Vienna Philharmonic and the State Opera at the center of that problem, then we are already in a kind of complicated or complex structure, with the Philharmonic representing the symphonic tradition and the opera orchestra and the opera house, of course, representing the theatrical tradition. And even though the extraordinary structure of this dual musical organization, a kind of metaphor of the dual monarchy, you might say, is entirely coherent. In fact, two extraordinarily different worlds are represented. The symphonic tradition in the Austrian and the German context is a tradition associated very much with Protestantism and with liberalism, and the theatrical tradition with Catholicism and with conservatism. And if you think of those structures as the kind of basic home for the connection between the small world and the large world, we're also very much in the argument that Karl Schorsky made from the 1950s to the 1980s. Karl Schorsky came up this morning and is still the kind of anchor of these discussions and the connections between music and politics. Now, Schorsky wrote his book, actually a sequence of essays beginning here in Berkeley, as was stated this morning. And when the book was published finally in 1980, he wrote an introduction to the book talking about the history of his own book. And what he said in that introduction, it's eminently worth reading today, is that he conceived the history in the 1950s in a circumstance where the Cold War had really taken over the imagination, and where the crisis of liberalism in Austria, the crisis of the side that really belongs to the symphonic more than the theatrical tradition, was very much reflected by the crisis of liberalism in the United States. So it was the threat of liberalism, or the threat against liberalism in a Cold War setting in the McCarthy period, that in a way created the analog for him to try to structure the European world of the 19th and 20th century in a similar way. So if you think of peacemaking after the First World War and then the Second World War, the First World War ends with an assumption that we're still very much within a kind of European theater and a European world, and the peacemaking process at the end of the Second World War, which presents entirely different challenges, assumes a global situation in a kind of bilateral Cold War structure with entirely different levels of danger, meaning nuclear weapons, and a kind of global system in an articulation that continues to be relevant today, even though obviously since 1989 everything has changed. So in this context, and in the post-war life of both the microcosm of music in Vienna and the macrocosm of post-World War II, post-Holocaust, Cold War political and cultural contexts, there are many stories to be told, and it's a very difficult scenario to organize. But I would like to concentrate really on one figure as a kind of way in to the connections among some of these issues, and it's a figure who has just been mentioned in Bill's talk, and that is actually an American, Leonard Bernstein. Leonard Bernstein goes to Vienna personally for the first time in 1966, and as his biographers recount, one of them in particular in a chapter called The Conquest of Vienna, Leonard Bernstein becomes a phenomenon. Both musically and personally and symbolically, in a way that I think actually plays into some of these connections and actually helps to clarify them. So Bernstein arrives in 1966 to conduct two very large programs. One, an opera by Verdi, the last opera of Falstaff, and secondly, Das Lied von der Erde of Gustav Mahler. There's actually a connection between these two works because Gustav Mahler, as a conductor, was a passionate champion of Verdi's last opera, Falstaff. When he was the conductor in Hamburg in the mid-1890s, he actually brought Falstaff to Hamburg just a year after it was premiered for the world premiere in La Scala, Hamburg in 1894, and then 10 years later, as conductor in Vienna, brought Falstaff to Vienna for the first time to absolutely ecstatic reviews, which you can find. The second program of Bernstein's, of course, the great song cycle of Das Lied von der Erde. Now, Bernstein, as a composer, had actually made an appearance in Vienna. He wasn't there himself in the 1950s with performances of Wonderful Town in 1956 and West Side Story in German translation in 1960. And here you get into some of the ambiguities and discomfort zones of the Austrian reception of who was then the person who was then this young American Jewish composer. The broker in Bernstein's original arrival in Vienna was someone who became legendary in post-war Viennese musical life, a dramaturg named Marcel Pravi, very well known into a very advanced stage on the Viennese scene. He translated the texts of Bernstein's works into German and actually promoted the events entirely. And when someone at the Volksoper, the second opera house in Vienna, asked around who was this young man Bernstein who was to be performed in Vienna, the answer, and this is not an attributed comment, was, well, the name clearly suggests that this is some friend of Pravi's from his emigration period. Pravi was himself Jewish and had been in the United States during the Second World War. Wie der Name schon ansagt, anscheinend ein Freund von Pravi aus der Emigration. So that was Bernstein as a composer. Bernstein as a conductor arrived for Falstaff 10 years later, 1966, and Falstaff itself had, at that point, an extremely rich and heavily inflected, politically inflected history in Austrian performance. The most famous performances of this work had been given by Toscanini in the Salzburg Festival between 1935 and 1937. So we need to flash back for a few minutes. Toscanini, as you probably know, champion of both the Italian and the German repertoires, but with a very strong argument of a kind of pan-Europeanism, that the finest works are actually expressions of a kind of European enlightenment rather than the expressions of national traditions. Toscanini was the hero of Bayreuth in the early 1930s, and very famously sent a telegram to the Bayreuth Festival immediately at the end of January 1933, days after the accession of the National Socialist Party and Hitler to power, saying that he was resigning from the festival. That resignation liberated his summer schedule and enabled him to conduct at the Salzburg Festival, which in fact was extremely important not only for political and aesthetic reasons, but also for financial reasons, since the Salzburg Festival in the 1930s, like the Austrian economy in general, was in absolutely dire shape, positioning itself in a way as a kind of bastion against the pressures of Nazi Germany, which included substantial economic pressures. Nazi Germany, among other things, imposed a 1,000 mark tax on anybody crossing the Bavarian border into Austria, which put a huge burden on the most predictable audiences for the Salzburg Festival. So having Toscanini there as a kind of box office hero was one way of both internationalizing and saving the festival, and also marking the repertoire, including this Italian opera, as something radically new, since Salzburg had been performing its own traditions, largely based, as it is again today, in Mozart and Richard Strauss. These performances were enormously successful as well as meaningful, and Toscanini came back 3 years in a row, 35, 6, 7, and then in early 1938 repeated his crucial gesture of rejection of National Socialism by, in fact, resigning from the Salzburg Festival as he had resigned from Bayreuth 3 years before. And here, we historians tend once in a while to be date fetishists, and the precise date is here really quite significant. The Anschluss, as you know, took place in early March, but Toscanini's telegram resigning from Salzburg came in mid-February, in other words, several days after what we now recognize as the historic meeting between the Chancellor of Austria, Schuschnigg, and Hitler in Berchtesgaden, right, Hitler's retreat, which is actually just over the border from Salzburg. And it's at that point that in a way, the ceiling of the annexation of Austria is absolutely clear, so that about 4 weeks before the actual annexation, Toscanini resigns, which is again an extremely powerful gesture. The festival goes on, the performances of Falstaff go on, conducted now by Tullio Serafin, right, who continued to be a conductor of great significance after the war, but these performances now acquire a completely different feeling, especially in the very late period after the Anschluss, 1939, when it's known in Salzburg that while these performances are going on, the new alliance between Austria and especially the Austrian military and the German military, this alliance is being worked out, and the level and type of participation of the Austrian military in the imminent invasion of Poland is being worked out. So the context has radically changed. So it's here that Bernstein comes in this history in 1966. And what I think is important to remember is that though the historical circumstances are radically different, the sense of living in several historical epochs at the same time and having a kind of accumulated consciousness of living in multiple periods at the same time is especially intense in this context. This is, frankly, a basic principle that we professional historians very often fail to address and very often fail to try to impart to our students. And that is something that we actually know from common sense in our own lives, and that is that we all live in our own mental lives in several historical periods at the same time. So that living in the present is also living in the past. And the sense of where you are in history is always multiple, even though it moves. And when you take a highly vexed and extremely prominent series of performances, the audiences in Vienna in 1966, not all of them, but many of them, had an extremely powerful feeling of the history of this work in its different symbolic manifestations. And comments come out that actually reveal this. The performances were extraordinarily successful. There are quite a few of Bernstein's letters. These have now been published, but even before they were published, they were available online on the website of the Library of Congress, many of them in his own handwriting. They're extremely appealing letters to read and all very interesting. He was himself somewhat ambivalent about coming to Austria and wrote letters back to his longtime secretary, who had been his piano teacher as a child, as well as letters to his parents in Massachusetts, saying that he said, I'm slightly uncomfortable by my reception in Vienna. I'm somehow the new hero here. People tell me it's now fashionable to be Jewish in Vienna. And one way he responded to this, which is somewhat odd, is to offer television interviews in extremely limited German, where he actually wore Austrian traditional costuming, the so-called Tracht. You all know what it looks like. You can find these online again, an extremely interesting, very unreadable set of gestures where Bernstein, chain-smoking in Austrian dress, talks about this music. But the performances were extraordinary, and there is a record of this, and that is a record literally, although it's no longer a record, and that is a recording of this opera that, to my taste, I have to say, in terms of the conducting, is one of the most extraordinary opera recordings I know, that completely testifies to how he spoke about his experience with the orchestra of the Vienna State Opera, which, as we now know, is this double identified orchestra, that every note, every phrase was played with a kind of almost incomprehensible energy and erotic power that completely redefined what this work was about. Now, a well-known figure in the Philharmonic, and here's one of these strange comments, a concertmaster named Otto Strasser, had a fairly bizarre comment, and that is that Bernstein's sense of the character of Falstaff, not the music, but the actual figure of Sir John Falstaff, was very much a reflection of himself, of Leonard Bernstein, and that was that Falstaff, in Bernstein's image, is not a military hero, which he is in the early Shakespeare plays, or a buffoon, which he is, unfortunately, in many productions, and according to many, in the Merry Wives of Windsor, which is the source material for the Verdi opera, but a man, a kind of tragic figure who is always looking for sympathy for himself in a foreign country. Very interesting remark. A man looking for sympathy for himself in a foreign country. And then Strasser goes on, and this is a kind of almost stream of consciousness remark, but I find it incredibly compelling, that he had first met Bernstein on an earlier trip, on one of Bernstein's earlier trips to Austria, up on a hill, on a pathway overlooking the city of Salzburg, and the name of that path is called the Judenbergalm, sort of the Jewish mountain meadow. And he actually states this in the same context with his comment about Bernstein's performances. Bernstein then stayed in Vienna, performed Das Lied von der Erde, both the Verdi and the Mahler with Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, an important relationship, and then came back, as we've heard, as a kind of lifelong friend of the orchestra. I want to conclude with another almost, I think, even more vexed and interesting episode of Bernstein in Vienna to really reinforce again the kind of Cold War context, and that is the return in 1981 with his work called Mass, right? A work that is very rarely performed, I think for good reason, that dates from 1971. The work Mass from 1971 was commissioned by the Kennedy Center in Washington for its own opening, and commissioned largely through the brokerage of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis for the center named in after her husband. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis and Bernstein were friendly in New York. And the work Mass, especially the central movement, O Give Us Peace, right, Dona Nobis Pacem, quickly took on the aura of not only a kind of peace work or a work for peace, but much more specifically a work against the Vietnam War, for which the work drew the suspicion and attention of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. Just before the premiere of Mass in Washington, Bernstein had visited with Philip Berrigan in the Danbury State Penitentiary in Connecticut. Philip Berrigan, one of the two Berrigan brothers, as you'll recall, had been imprisoned in Danbury for allegedly attempting to kidnap Henry Kissinger. So Hoover wrote in an internal memo that he doubts very much when this work is premiered at the Kennedy Center that the audiences would understand the true political context of the work and actually how unpleasant or subversive it may be. When the work went to Vienna 10 years later in 1981, the context was both very different, but in a way not so different. So the context was now this genius, superstar, American Jewish conductor conducting his own, he didn't conduct, but performing his own work, again translated into German by Marcel Pravi, who had been his translator and broker from the mid-1950s. And Bernstein, again, with a great sense of his own theater, arrived in Vienna from Rome, where he had had an audience with the Pope, which was all noted in the Austrian press. And again, the question became, is this work a Catholic work? Is it a Jewish work? Is it none of the above? And Bernstein's response to these questions, they were addressed to him very directly, was that it is in fact both. It is both Catholic and Jewish, and there's really no problem with this double identity. It carries the tradition of the Mass, including the structure and many of the words, but as he said, in what I would consider myself a certain dubious ecumenicism, that many of his friends had told him it was also a deeply Jewish work because it was written from a point of view of intimacy with God, and therefore had this other dimension as well. But I think you get the point from this fairly unusual and slightly discomforting story that the radically different contexts of how this work and how the figure played in the United States and in Austria also have a certain common denominator, and that is the local situation, which is the tradition of Central European music, the tensions, sometimes productive tensions, sometimes unproductive tensions between the symphonic world and the operatic world, between sacred music and secular music, and between the arts and politics in general. How this then plays through this small story into the larger world of the Cold War. Vienna, as is less often remarked, certainly in comparison to Berlin, was an occupied city after 1945. The Soviet army left Vienna in 1955, coordinated with the declaration of the Second Austrian Republic in 1955. And that departure from Central Europe also coincided with the possibility of a certain restricted remobilization of both Austria and Germany as military powers, the restoration of a civilian airline in Germany, Lufthansa, which had been part of the German Air Force and therefore not allowed to exist until the post-war situation had destabilized. And again, a fact that comes up in history courses more than in opera houses, one of the kind of ramifications of this Central European shifting of capacity in the mid-1950s, 10 years after the end of World War II, was the withdrawal of French troops from what had been called Indochina. Anxiety in France that there could be a partial remobilization in Central Europe, especially in Germany, meant that the French government wanted a stronger military presence in Europe, taking its forces out of Indochina and then, in fact, causing the perceived need in that perceived vacuum for American attention, U.S. attention to what became ultimately the East Asian and Vietnamese sphere. So I conclude with that. It's not where we've been really today, but I conclude with that really as a way of indicating that the large world of global politics has a certain wire that connects it to what would seem to be fairly luxurious and restricted contexts of musical life in Central Europe. And thank you so much.
We don't, I'm afraid. We don't have time for questions because the University Orchestra is about to take over this space, but I want to thank Adam Hochschild, William McElheney, and Michael Steinberg for wonderful presentations. Gentlemen. It's great, really, wonderful, fascinating.
And thank you to Tom Laqueur for moderating. For those of you coming back tomorrow, the symposium continues for a 2-hour session, not in here, but in Wheeler Auditorium at 11 a.m. Remember, the clocks go forward, so spring forward. So you have 1 hour less sleep. And for those of you with concert tickets for tonight, the pre-concert talk is at 7, the concert is at 8, and if you're lucky, there might be 1 or 2 tickets still available. Thank you.